So, are we owners, stewards, or children of earth? How do you think of yourself? How many people think that you are an owner of earth? Raise your hand. Don't be shy. A couple of hands. Yeah, all right. Okay. How many of you think you're a steward of earth?
Subject to.
How many of you think you're children of earth? How many think that you're more than one of those? Yeah, probably, right? Yeah. All right. Well, how you answer reflects how you treat the earth, and how you answer basically is determined by where you grew up, the influences in your life. Some being out at Camp Linden is one of the best things they can do to get into the soil and the sunshine there. I will admit I grew up a city boy, so I don't think I feel quite as comfortable in nature as some others do. But when I was a boy, many of you know, I would travel up to Quebec, Canada with my family, and my father would go out at night and set up the telescope and gaze at the stars and teach my younger brother about the celestial map, and they'd write things down in their logs. And I'd enjoy it for a little while, but then I'd go back inside. So here I am talking about nature, but I'm inside a building. I'm not on a mountaintop or in the forest or out at sea somewhere, and I'm a city boy. So obviously take my words with a grain of salt. I'm doing the best I can. Here's my main message that I'm going to give you today. As a species, human beings are owners and stewards and children. And the issue is not whether you're one or the other, but whether you are being ethical owners, stewards, or children of nature. That's what we're going to explore today. So let's start with ownership. In the little book, The Little Prince, there's a moment when the little prince runs into a businessman who's busily looking at the stars and writing things down in his ledger and counting them all. And the little prince goes, "What are you doing? Why are you counting those stars? What are you going to do with them?" And the businessman sort of hesitates and says, "What am I going to do with them?" "Nothing. I own them." Now the irony of that is obviously the stars are not something you really can own in the sense that you can keep them for yourself, keep them away from other people, for your exclusive use. Because they can't be denied to any of us. Tom Hartman, in a book called The Last Hours of Sunlight, which I think some of you read here a couple of years ago, I found a number of copies and notes from people, he says that modern cultures, with roots all the way back to the Greeks, are the sorts of cultures that are human-centric. He says they're younger cultures, and they tend to look at the world as if you could own parts of it. They're most likely to say that you can hoard the treasures and use them privately for yourself. There's less of a sense of sacred sharing, for lack of a better word. From Aristotle, who said plants exist for the sake of animals and brute beasts for the sake of man, domestic animals for his use in food, and wild ones for food and other accessories like tools and clothing. Cicero, the Roman philosopher, said, "We are absolute masters of the earth, of what it produces. The mountains and plains are for our enjoyment. The rivers belong to us." Thomas Bacon described nature in a feminine and subservient manner, so he urges us to, quote, "bind her to your service and make her your slave." Engels says that humans are the true masters of nature. So are these phrases inspiring, or are they ugly? Now, parts of the Bible promote an ownership model. In Genesis 1:26, God supposedly said of humans, "Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and the fowl of the air and over the cattle and over all the earth and every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." You don't hear that phrase often. Creepeth upon the earth. Some scholars trace this word dominion to Hebrew roots meaning to subjugate, to reign, to rule over. Seeing nature only in terms of utility, of being valued to how to fulfill human needs, reinforces the ownership model. As our leader emeritus Richard Canary pointed out in a recent essay, although the Bible says that God gave humans the power to name and use animals, he's not quite sure where these writers of the Bible got permission to give us that power. Right? Ralph Waldo Emerson offered Thoreau some land on Walden Pond at one point, and Thoreau was very grateful, but he said, he didn't really want to own it because it belonged to the raccoon or the beaver. So for better or worse, the reality is we'll probably always have landowners. I don't think that's going to change. But as I said, the real question is whether they're going to be ethically responsible owners who care for their property and improve it and tend it and hand it on to future generations. Which is somewhat what the idea of stewardship is about. There are elements in the Bible that do give that more stewardship model. Bob Taft, who is author of a book that I used for a lot of the essays in this talk, talked about what it would be like if we actually all took the Bible's advice and acted like Francis of Assisi, the patron saint of animals. Might be a very different world that we're living in. Genesis 2:15 describes how God put man in the Garden of Eden to, quote, dress it and keep it. In other words, to work it, to serve it, to guard it, to protect it, to preserve it. And in this context, human beings are portrayed not as owners of earth, but as stewards. A couple of years ago, I spoke with Shelley DePaul at Camp Linden, and she was doing Lenape. She's a Lenape chief, and she did a program for our children there. And she asked whether the Ethical Society would be willing to sign on to the Treaty of Renewed Friendship, which talked about the Lenape being the spiritual keepers of the Delaware River. And it reminded me a lot. We did sign on to it. It didn't have legal binding, but it reminded me that we have this sense from many indigenous cultures that we need to tread lightly on earth. Ed Erickson, who was the leader of the Washington Ethical Society for a few decades, wrote, "A generation never has the right to forfeit the future. It's not ours to hold hostage. Not one of us is immortal, but we must safeguard with religious humility the immortality of the human future." So maybe we borrow it rather than own it. I'm thinking. Entrepreneur and environmentalist Peter Barnes wrapped up this generational obligation into the idea of the commons. The commons is something I'm going to talk about a little bit more next month, but it means the, quote, sum of all we inherit together and must pass on, undiminished and more or less equally to our heirs. Barnes said that a key distinction between the commons are, he says that those are things that we can't really buy or sell, like the air or water, although we're beginning to sell that a lot, aren't we? Compared to things that are in the market, which you can sell and buy. And he argues that the natural environment should be considered the commons. This idea of shared resources is really behind some of the idea of the commonwealth that we are within. Now, the Commonwealth was originally used by the Romans and some Renaissance thinkers to mean a political entity, but many people use it today to really talk about it as our shared living space, our commonwealth. And a concrete representation of this is something called a public trust. A lot of states are using public trust as legal entities in order to protect the natural resources for the people. Wisconsin has a law that says that the state protects the land for the people. The state's job is to act as a trustee of these resources and for the people in future generations. The idea of stewardship and trusteeship was something that was debated between two Americans 100 years ago. Gifford Pinchot and John Muir were friends. Pinchot was head of the Forestry Service, and John Muir was the man who got Congress to create National Park in Yosemite, and he founded the Sierra Club. And the focus on Gifford Pinchot was on a sort of stewardship, but he wanted what was called sustainable yield. He wanted economic benefits drawn out of nature for man. So when you looked at the lumber industry or mining, how can we get the most out of it and sustain it so it doesn't die on us? Whereas Muir said, although again it's humanocentric, he said it was for us more so for rest, inspiration, renewal, and prayers. And while Muir was again focusing on human needs, he cared more for the psychological and spiritual aspects of our relationship to nature. And I think that that demonstrates in a way, part of his writing shows that he had a belief that nature, independent of human needs, has intrinsic value. Sarah Ohlberg, who was an author who I got to know at the Humanist Institute, helped me understand this perspective within humanism. In her article, Eco-Humanism, So What's New, she writes about something she calls existence value. She explains this as a kind of, quote, ecological because it is there attitude, where nature is respected because it exists. This is something that Richard wrote in his article a little bit. He talks about nature should be respected simply because it exists. He says, quote, what is deserving of respect by its very presence. So does nature have inherent worth in that way? I'll leave that hanging. I'm not going to answer it right now. Because I'm torn. Conservationist Aldo Leopold supports what he calls a land ethic. He says that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. And this treats the natural world sort of like we treat human beings, or try to, or commit to. We try to treat human beings as if they're of inherent worth, unique, precious, irreplaceable. So maybe this motivates us to be stewards of nature and manage it out of respect for future generations, but including out of respect for nature itself. I think this respect for nature itself is maybe wrapped up a little bit in the idea of us being children of nature. I mean, as children, what does it mean to be a child of nature? What I take it to mean is that we are in need of being taught. We're young. We have to be open and learn what nature has to teach us. One of the most cited spokespersons is Chief Seattle, and maybe you may remember Kim McKay's son Elliot read at our Thanksgiving his following words. Chief Seattle from the Squamish tribe is credited for saying, teach your children what we have taught our children, that the earth is our mother. Whatever befalls the earth befalls sons and daughters of the earth. If men spit on the ground, they spit upon themselves. This we know. The earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth. Now, plenty of humanists and scientists talk similarly to some indigenous wise people. Sagan, E.O. Wilson, they understood that we're more children of the universe than we are masters of the universe. And given how nature determines our very survival, this seems realistic, scientifically realistic. But I think it's unwise to think of ourselves as children as being helplessly dependent on nature. I mean, maybe in the long run we are, when the sun explodes, for example. Right? But given the rise of global warming and our contribution to it, we can't be helpless children. We have to learn, grow up, be adult children, and take responsibility. We have to be more ethical as children and as stewards and as owners. But for me, in all those three areas, more connection with the earth is what I think we need more than anything. I think I have to immerse myself more in nature to get in touch with that. Ohlberg says that human experience is not only of nature, but also in nature, in the interconnected web of life. Mike French, another ethical culture leader, told me that he thinks we should recognize our creatureliness, that sees ourselves as part of a family broader than Homo sapiens. Now, maybe one of the problems in humanism is the glorification of our species, which underappreciates the wholeness of which we are a part. I wrote recently about one symbol often found within traditional humanism, Leonardo da Vinci's famous sketch of the Vitruvian Man. It's an image of a man perfectly proportioned inside of the center of a circle. And ethical culture's logo is roughly connected to that in sort of a stick figure drawing of that. Leonardo believed that the human body, that the structure of our beings mirrored the structure of the universe. So he looked at human beings as a gateway to understand the universe. But within humanism, this image often was used to elevate us to some privileged position of distinguishment as fundamentally different than the rest of nature. And we all get tripped up in it. I always sort of say, man in nature, when we are nature. We're a part of it. Some of you have told me that you love Alan Watts' writings. He blamed Christianity primarily for this glorification of human beings. He said that early Christianity rejected gnosis, which is the direct experience of God, in favor of pistis, which is, quote, the trust of the will in certain revealed propositions about God. Watts says, in the beginning was the Word, and Christianity has ever since been obsessed with the realm of words and thoughts and symbols separate from experience and nature. Words and the power of naming facilitated breaking nature up into constituent pieces, pushing the oneness of nature further away. And I think humanism got caught up in that as well. Now, thankfully, science is actually taking back the oneness. There was a time where science was only focusing on the division of the various fields of science. But now we understand that if you're going to understand a single cell, you have to understand how that cell is in part of an organ. You have to understand how that organ is part of a human body. You have to understand how that human body is part of an ecosystem. And you don't understand one without the other. So all is connected. Mike Franch puts it this way: we are all one ball of life on this blue-green planet. All is connected. Sarah Olberg talked about this as being a part of what she calls ecofeminism, which rejects hierarchy and patriarchy and anthropocentrism within Christianity and humanism. And she writes, my humanism has always embraced the idea of oneness with nature. That as human beings we are part and parcel of the physical and natural universe. It is nature and not the supernatural that provides me with my sense of meaning, wonder, and awe. The discovery of my place in the context of the cosmos. Howard Radis, who was a leading ethical culturist for generations, died a couple of years ago, put it well. Our history and our images point to the need to relocate the human animal from stardom to company, from observer to partner, from user to dweller. Kurt Collier, who is going to be giving the platform address at our annual assembly in Albuquerque in June, is somebody that I value quite a bit. He focuses on this oneness. Kurt left ethical culture leadership to become the head of Groundworks USA and is a real brilliant scholar of ecological awareness and its connection to ethical culture. And I wrote an essay, asked him to critique, and he did a couple of years ago, and he urged me to stop thinking so much about Earth and start being with it more. I have to admit, I probably haven't done as well as I should have in that regard. I think about it a lot. But he noticed how how I abstractly idealize the Earth. So I talk about it in terms of reverence rather than being immersed in it. He recommended Michael Pollan's advice in Second Nature that the only thing that will save us, this wondrous planet, is a new role for us, not as worshiper, but as a partner in relationship akin to marriage. Now, Kurt's a gardener. He loves gardening. He talks about how his understanding of his place in the universe is helped by getting into the soil and digging through it. I actually use the garden often to talk about relationships, lifelong partner relationships or marriage. How you have to tend. You have to take the garbage out and put it in the soil. You've got to turn it up, and you've got to wait, and you've got to be patient. It's not all your power. You are working in a conversation with nature, and that's what Kurt was trying to say. Now, ideally, I would do that. I am a philosopher, come from an academic tradition, but Felix Adler, who founded this community, was also that. But he did get into nature. Most of you know, I talked about this a while ago, that when he was young and going to get his PhD in Europe, he contracted an illness on the way over. His doctor said, you must recover, and they put him in a hospital in the Alps, and then he went hiking in the fresh air. And he vowed to create that experience for himself back in the United States when he returned. And his daughter, Ruth Adler Fries, wrote an essay called Life in the Adirondacks, which talked about the family vacations in Keene Valley. And Adler brought his family to this summer cottage where friends and associates came there, including Winslow Homer, Mark Twain, John Dewey. Even an intellectualist like Adler felt a connection with nature that was visceral. He explored nature. He loved nature. Scientists and philosophers, and maybe even me, can learn to love nature. Albert Schweitzer talked about his reverence for life, about loving the will to live that he saw in all creatures on earth. E.O. Wilson spoke of biophilia, a primal love and engagement with nature. And he used that to reach out to Southern Baptists in an open letter he wrote. He said, "You and I are both humanists in the broadest sense. Human welfare is at the center of thought. Surely we also share a love of creation. There remains," he says, "an earthbound yet transcendental obligation we're both morally bound to share." And if you're interested in how theists and non-theists can work on the environment, I urge you to go to the Power discussion table during our coffee hour and find out how we as a humanist, non-theist organization is working with theist organizations through Power on various initiatives towards environmental awareness. Now, a lot of my idealism came not from walking in the woods, but from watching a film I saw about 30 years ago called No Frames, No Boundaries. And in it, Rusty Schweiker, who was an astronaut in the Apollo 9 mission, talked about a near-conversion experience he had looking back at the Earth. He said, "When you go around the Earth in an hour and a half, you begin to recognize your identity is with that whole thing. And that makes a change. From where you see it, the Earth is whole, and it is so beautiful. You realize on that small spot, that little blue and white thing that you can cover with your thumb, is everything that means anything to you. All of history and music and poetry and art and birth and love, tears, joy, games, all of it." James Irwin, another astronaut, described his conversion experience. He said, "The Earth reminded us of a Christmas tree ornament hanging in the blackness of space. That beautiful, warm, living object looked so fragile, so delicate, that if you touched it with a finger, it would crumble and fall apart. Seeing this has to change a person. Seeing this has to change a person. Just watching the film changed me, maybe not enough, but it pushed me in that direction. And artists can help philosophers and scientists. Radis talks about the need for a felt connection with our planet. And he says we should do it with more poetry and music and ritual and dance. Come to the Universal Dances of Peace here, by the way, May 5th. If you want to dance for peace. So it's not so foreign for humanism, and it's not supernaturalism to get into those elements that maybe some intellectuals and even me in my past felt was too close to a supernaturalism. Curtis Reese, who was one of the founders of religious humanism in this country, a Unitarian minister, said that while abandoning the supernatural, humanism expands the natural. In eco-humanism, Radis says that the possibilities of an aesthetic transaction, he says he's going to do that even though it risks, quote, the charges of mysticism and intuition from my rationalist companions. But he feels like we have to take the risk to explore and push the boundaries and get a more visceral connection to nature, whether that is through walking in the wilderness, singing songs, writing poetry. Carol Wintermute, who was born here in Philly and 2 years ago died, and she was in numerous humanist organizations, wrote an article entitled Humanism's Missing Link. And what she meant was that our missing link was that aesthetic tradition, that connection through beauty to this planet. She says aesthetics is the key. It's our missing link. It's nonverbal. It is image. It requires both left and right brain. It provides a balance to science, reason, and philosophy. Now to conclude, while I think humanism has to connect to nature through any vehicle it can, and through any role as owner and steward or child, it's not ethical humanism if it's not connected to action. That's where the hard part comes in. If it doesn't change your ethical behavior, if it doesn't come out in your deeds, it's not ethical humanism. So if feelings of transcendence by staring at the stars help you do more to save this planet, that's good. If getting out to Camp Linden gets you to connect more with what sort of carbons you're burning every day, that's a good thing. And maybe we're not even close to as radical as we have to be in those regards. But in exploring your identity with this planet, whether you think yourself as more of a child or a steward or an owner, it's clear in reality we are all three of those. I mean, it may seem absurd to say that we own the air or the water, resources that are basic, that we share, that are everywhere. We have to be more responsible owners to nurture and improve the land we have, to give it to our children's and our children's children, 7 generations down and more. We have to be better stewards. Stewards for everyone, not just for the wealthy who own the land. Stewards have to protect the common good of nature for everyone. And as children, we have to be humble and open to learning more than we know now. We can't be spoiled or helpless children incapable of stopping the destruction of the planet that we call our home. Thank you very much.